Here we are on Facebook Live with another fantastic guest today. It's James O'Keefe. He's an award-winning journalist and writer, founder and president of Project Veritas, an organization dedicated to investigating corruption, dishonesty, waste, and fraud in both public and private institutions. It's a brand new book. It is right here. It is American Pravda, My Fight for Truth in the Era of Fake News. James, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ben, for having me.
So one of the things that obviously comes up a lot whenever people discuss James O'Keefe and talk about you is whether or not you are a journalist. And what I've always said is that you are a sort of activist / journalist, that your goal is to go in and expose things, not in the way that the New York Times would, but by actually going in and exposing the motivations of people by going undercover with them. How would you describe what it is that you do?
I would say journalism, Ben, is an activity, not an identity, or is at least an activity. And Aristotle sort of said you are what you repeatedly do. So by any measure, what Project Veritas has done ever since the days of Andrew Breitbart, when I met you, is defund organizations, get dozens of people fired, swing various Senate elections, go undercover into Twitter, exposing people in their own words. And journalism is about shaming the devil and telling the truth and capturing people in their own words. Not, I love your quote, "Facts don't care about your feelings." So ultimately, it's about the facts. It's about the facts that are on videotape.
And one of the things that James has gotten tons of flack for is actually going undercover and bringing film back. And that film is always, it makes people deeply uncomfortable when they're caught on film. And James, you mentioned that I got to know you when you were in the middle of exposing Acorn, and we met through Andrew Breitbart. And that, of course, is a great piece of journalism that ended up essentially destroying that organization, as well it should. And lately, you've done that to Twitter. You mentioned that you'd gone undercover at Twitter and gotten people at Twitter to essentially admit that they were biasing their algorithms and picking out certain accounts and all the rest of it. So one of the complaints that has been lodged against you by the left is the selective editing complaint. They've been doing this all the way since the Acorn days. How do you tend to fight back against that complaint?
Well, the only actual edit, Ben, they ever refer to is when I went in as a pimp, and with Hannah as they say, well, you didn't wear the pimp costume. But I would say that pimp protocol doesn't require wearing a pimp costume to be a pimp. It requires saying that you want to, I suppose, start brothels, which is what we said. So they're never able to actually point to a specific editorial edit. They just use that as a kind of hyperbole. And I would say that newspaper reporters, I mean, they paint portraits with words. They use words in such a way as to sort of obfuscate. But we call it veritas, is the Latin word for truth, cinema verite. It's reporting people in their own words. So they're not able to actually talk about a specific edit. It's just used as an ad hominem attack. And I can point to many specific edits. Katie Couric got sued for defamation for that gun documentary. The Rolling Stone had to retract an entire story that wasn't even true in Virginia. Alison Camerata doctored some. So editing happens all the time. What matters is, are you showing people in their own words, and is it in context? And they're never able to specifically point out to an edit.
So in your book, American Pravda, James O'Keefe, you talk a fair bit about how you've been on the wrong end of government investigations and government targeting schemes. What's that been like, and how do you deal with that?
The book is really a treatise on modern media. It takes a lot of moral courage for people to go undercover, like David Daleiden, who was targeted by the California Attorney General, his home was raided, his hard drives were confiscated. Our journalists get detained on the border when they cross border, and border security asks who they're voting for, what stories they're working on. And again, Ben, it comes down to the fact that the system doesn't believe that we're journalists, so they can violate our Fourth and First Amendment rights because they don't like us. And what worries me is, in this country, increasingly, many people in the media, say off with his head, put him in jail, and they can't point to a specific law that's broken. They just don't like certain things exposed. So I think we're reaching an inflection point in American history where the only real journalism is going to be done by independent people. It's not going to be done by cable news. It's not going to be done by New York Times, because those organizations have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And that's not just my words. Noam Chomsky said the same thing. So it's not a right-wing propaganda-supported thing. And independent people have to go do it, but we are literally fighting for our very lives, fighting for our rights to do it. And all the while being kneecapped by state attorneys generals who wants to put us in jail.
One of the things that's so fascinating about the stuff that you do, James, and it's different from what journalists typically do, is every so often you'll see a journalist do a story where they sort of attempt to sneak weapons through TSA, for example, just to see if things work. But the way that you guys do journalism is a lot more like that than it is like the New York Times sitting around and waiting for somebody to leak to them from the White House. It's a lot more, what would somebody do if they were given the opportunity to do it? You go in there and you present a scenario to somebody and you say to them, okay, now are you willing to fund a brothel, or are you willing to engage in an application for a public works project that literally involves digging a hole and then filling it back in, which is something you did with the union up in New York. How do you choose which projects to do? Because some of them work, some of them fail, some of them are great ideas, some of them aren't so great ideas. How do you figure out which ones to pursue?
Great question. We use deception as a means of gaining access. We've gotten a lot of flack, and even some from you, and that's fair. We've gotten a lot of flack from people who assume that we are actually trying to do what we say we. So a good example would be the Washington Post, and they said, "Well, you tried to plant a fake story." Actually, we were trying to gain trust by posing as a victim, so that another human being could trust us and divulge sort of journalistic malpractices or hard and loose with the facts. Like when I went in as a pimp, I didn't actually intend to start a brothel.
Right.
I was trying to establish a rapport with a government worker. Maybe they would be the Abu Ghraib of the Great Society, as Andrew Breitbart said. So how do we choose? We go after the sacred cows. We go after the organizations and institutions that people are unable to go after. We use deception because we believe that the media is not being virtuous in passing along untrue information from their sources. We challenge the sources by talking to them in private. And what we find, Post case, was national security reporters at the Washington Post saying, we don't really believe there's anything there. That's not my words, that's their words. So oftentimes what people say in private is much more true than what they'll pass along to the masses publicly. And the ultimate paramount virtue is being truthful to the masses. And oftentimes the only way to do that, Ben, is by going undercover.
Well, the book is American Pravda. The journalist, the undercover journalist, is James O'Keefe. And I'm not going to ask you to reveal any of the projects that you have on the table, because obviously that would defeat the purpose of doing what it is that you do. But can you say if you have some new material coming out anytime soon?
We just relaunched a story on Twitter. The chief operations officer of Twitter has resigned in recent weeks, and I think big tech is going to be a massive theme this year, as well as the elections.
Well, it should be fascinating, and we'll all be watching, obviously, what you do. If you haven't seen James' material, we do cover it over at Daily Wire. It's been covered in places like Drudge Report, and of course, it makes the left media absolutely mad, regardless of what it is that James brings out. So the book, again, is American Pravda. James, thanks so much for spending a few minutes. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.